I did not plan to speak about this. Not now. Not ever. There are moments a leader carries in silence because language feels too small and explanation feels dangerous. Yet silence, too, can become a form of betrayal. Tonight, I choose to speak. I am a Muslim. I was raised to honor Isa ibn Maryam as a prophet, not to worship him, not to pray in his name, but to respect his moral weight. I say this clearly, because what I am about to recount does not belong neatly to any doctrine. It unsettles me even as I speak it. My country had just survived a storm, a failed coup, hidden hands, sleepless days where the phone never stopped ringing and every decision felt like it could spill blood. Power had concentrated quickly, faster than I wanted, faster than wisdom usually allows. Allies demanded loyalty, enemies tested boundaries. The people waited, silently, desperately. After more than 12 hours of continuous security briefings, I did not go to bed. I fell forward at my desk, papers beneath my cheek, a pen still in my hand. What followed was not sleep as I know it. I found myself in a space that was neither inside nor outside. There were no walls, yet I was enclosed. No sky, yet light was everywhere. Not shining from above or below, but existing, thick and heavy, like the air before a violent storm. I could feel weight in the ground beneath me. I could feel movement in the air. It was too real to dismiss. Then he was there. I recognized him without being told. Not the pale images I had seen in foreign books, not African, not European. A Middle Eastern man, sun-darkened skin, worn hands, dust on simple clothes. A face marked by endurance rather than softness. His eyes did not accuse. They did not comfort either. They saw. He said my name. Ibrahim. My body reacted before my thoughts. I wanted to fall, to lower myself instinctively, as one does before something overwhelming. He stopped me with a gesture that carried no force, yet could not be refused. Stand, he said. We do not have much time. Everything in me resisted. My reason rose first. I told myself this was exhaustion, that this was not how revelation works for us, that I am a man trained in discipline, not visions. But the ground had weight. The air moved when he spoke, and I was more awake than I had been in weeks. That is where my struggle began. If this was not real, it was the most honest dream I have ever known. And if it was real, then it carried a responsibility I could no longer avoid. I am telling you this not to persuade you of belief, but to confess a moment that changed how I understand power. I argued with him first in my mind, then with my voice. I said what any rational man would say. I told him I am Muslim, that our tradition does not seek visions in this way, that fatigue can create convincing illusions, that leaders under pressure often see what they fear most. He listened without interruption. Then he spoke words that unsettled me, not because they contradicted my faith, but because they ignored it entirely. Christians worship me, he said, calmly, without pride, but many no longer follow what I taught. Muslims respect me, but often stop at reverence and never ask why I was sent. I felt no insult in his words, only a mirror. He told me I had not been chosen because I was pure or wiser than others or closer to God. He said I was chosen because I was standing at the edge of a decision that would determine whether thousands would live in fear or dignity. You are about to mistake necessity for righteousness, he said, and you will call it leadership. Then the space around us shifted. I saw my capital as it might look 6 months from now. Smoke rising from neighborhoods I knew by name. Gunfire echoing where children once played. People running, not from foreign invaders, but from their own state. The streets were controlled, but empty of trust. I saw myself, older, colder, signing documents without reading them, calling executions stability, calling silence peace. Power had replaced conscience so gradually that I no longer noticed the exchange. This is how dictators are born, he said, not from evil intentions, but from justified exceptions. He showed me the words leaders use when crossing that line. For security, for order, because I am different, because the times are extraordinary. I wanted to argue again, to say our enemies are real. That chaos is not theoretical, that weakness invites destruction. He did not deny this. Instead, he said something that still weighs on me. Security without justice teaches people to obey, he said. Justice without security teaches people to hope. A leader must choose which lesson he leaves behind. I asked the question that had been forming in me since the beginning. Why tell me this? I asked. Why not those who claim to follow you? His answer was quiet. Because you still hesitate, he said. And hesitation is the last refuge of the soul before it hardens. Before he faded, I challenged him one final time. How will I know this was real? I asked. He did not give me proof. He gave me a test. If these words are true, he said, does their origin matter? Then he promised this. Within one day, 3 warnings would be confirmed by sources I did not expect, from places I did not control. The light thinned. The air released its weight. I woke at my desk, the pen fallen from my hand, the room unchanged, but I was no longer the same man who had fallen asleep. I did not have to wait long for the first confirmation. Before the sun completed its arc, the pressure arrived exactly as it had been shown to me. My generals came first. Men who had stood beside me when the ground itself seemed uncertain. Men who had risked their lives and who believed, sincerely, that force was the only language chaos understands. Their voices were calm, professional, almost compassionate. They told me journalists were undermining morale. They told me opposition figures were weakening unity. They told me criticism, even peaceful criticism, was a luxury a fragile state could not afford. If we do not act now, they said, we will lose control. The argument was not cruelty. It was fear dressed as responsibility. They offered lists, names, addresses, suggested detentions that could be justified as temporary. They promised order would follow quickly. They promised history would forgive us once stability returned. As they spoke, I remembered the vision. I remembered smoke rising from familiar streets. I remembered my future self signing orders without reading. I remembered the words, dictators are born from justified exceptions. I dismissed the meeting without a decision. That was when the second voice arrived, quieter, more dangerous. Advisors who did not wear uniforms. Men who spoke of optics, international legitimacy, and narrative management. They suggested arrests framed as anti-terrorism, silence framed as unity, fear framed as patriotism. They told me people do not need freedom in times of danger, they need direction. It was persuasive, logical, clean, and it terrified me. Because I recognized the language, I had heard it before, not only in Africa, but in powerful nations that claim to defend democracy while hollowing it from within. I realized then that oppression does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers reassurance. That night, alone, I asked myself a question no briefing could answer. If my power survives by silencing voices, what exactly am I protecting? The next morning, I chose surveillance over suppression, dialogue over detention. I instructed my security services to monitor threats, not critics, to listen before reacting, to differentiate danger from dissent. The cost was immediate. Some officers called me naive. Some allies withdrew their enthusiasm. Rumors of betrayal began to circulate. I felt exposed, vulnerable, almost irresponsible. But something unexpected happened. Opponents accepted dialogue. Journalists, once defensive, became cautious but open. The revolution did not fracture, it breathed. That was the first confirmation. The warning had been real, the temptation had been real, and so had the choice. The soul of power, I learned, is not tested when obedience is easy. It is tested when fear demands obedience in exchange for survival. This was only the beginning. The second temptation did not arrive with threats. It arrived with smiles, signatures, and carefully worded promises. Foreign delegations requested meetings, not urgently, respectfully. They praised my restraint. They congratulated our transition. They spoke of partnership, stability, and shared interests. Their tone suggested equality, but their documents told a different story. They offered military assistance, equipment, training, intelligence cooperation. They offered economic relief, development programs, and diplomatic recognition that would make critics fall silent. Each offer was wrapped in concern for our people, and each came with conditions that were never written in bold. Access to our resources, influence over our policy choices, silence about the past that still bleeds into the present. They did not call it control, they called it cooperation. In the vision I had been warned, not every helping hand is extended to lift. Some are extended to guide you where they want you to go. One envoy spoke with particular elegance. He told me sovereignty is an outdated concept in a globalized world. He said dependence is inevitable, so it might as well be managed by friends. He promised prosperity if I learned to compromise on principles that, in his words, no longer feed people. I asked him a simple question. If these agreements are so beneficial, I said, why must they be signed quickly before my people can examine them? He smiled, as one smiles at an idealistic child. Because hesitation creates uncertainty, he replied, and uncertainty frightens markets. I remembered another phrase from the vision. There is no aid that is free in moral terms. That night I read every clause myself, slowly, without advisors, without interruption. I saw how autonomy dissolves not in one dramatic betrayal, but in 1,000 small concessions that each seem reasonable alone. I refused the agreements that required silence about our sovereignty. I declined assistance that demanded obedience disguised as gratitude. I chose a harder path with fewer resources and fewer friends. The consequences followed swiftly. International media questioned my competence. Aid was delayed. Isolation was hinted at, then applied. There were days I doubted myself. Days I wondered if pride was masquerading as principle. Days when the suffering caused by scarcity felt heavier than any moral argument. But something else emerged. Decisions became ours again. Mistakes were ours to correct. Success, when it came, belonged to our people. That was the second confirmation. The warning had been true. The temptation had been seductive. Freedom, I learned, is not the absence of hardship. It is the refusal to trade one form of suffering for another that lasts generations. Power does not only ask whether you will rule, it asks who you will belong to. There was still one warning left, and it was the most painful of all. The third temptation did not come from fear. It came from love. A man I had known for years was accused of corruption. We had trained together, shared meals in moments when death felt close. He had protected me when hesitation could have cost my life. In the language of revolution, he was family. The evidence arrived quietly, not dramatic, not public. Documents that did not shout, but accumulated. Accounts that did not scream guilt, but pointed toward it with unbearable patience. My advisors divided immediately. Some said the accusations were exaggerated. Some said this was not the time for internal conflict. Some said loyalty was the foundation of survival. They reminded me of everything he had sacrificed. They reminded me that enemies would celebrate our division. They reminded me that mercy toward allies strengthens trust. I understood every argument, and that was the danger. In the vision, I had been shown this moment, not the man's face, but my own hesitation. I heard the warning again. Every revolution dies the day the law no longer applies to those closest to power. I asked myself what kind of country we were building. One ruled by principles, or one ruled by proximity to authority? One where justice stands above friendship, or one where friendship bends justice into silence? I delayed the decision for one night. That night was heavier than any I remember. I did not sleep. I replayed conversations. I weighed intentions against consequences. I tried to convince myself that postponement was wisdom. But postponement, I realized, is often the first act of corruption. The next morning, I authorized a full investigation. Independent, transparent, without immunity. I removed him from his position pending the outcome. I did not call him beforehand. That is the part that still hurts. When he was informed, he did not shout. He did not plead. He looked at me with something worse than anger. He looked at me as if I had erased a shared history. I lost a friend that day. I gained no applause. Some called me cold, others called me ungrateful. A few warned that no one would ever trust me again. They were wrong. Trust did not disappear, it changed shape. People began to believe that proximity to me offered no protection from accountability, that loyalty did not place anyone above the law, that power did not grant exemption from principle. That was the third confirmation. The warning had been precise, the temptation had been intimate, and the cost had been personal. Power, I learned, reveals itself most clearly not in how it treats enemies, but in how it treats friends. I thought the lesson was complete. I was mistaken, because what remained was not temptation, but teaching. When the temptations had passed, I expected silence. Instead, the presence returned, not as an interruption, but as a conclusion. Not urgent this time, firm, measured, as if what remained could only be said once the tests were lived, not imagined. He did not speak of theology. That surprised me. He did not explain heaven or hell, sin or salvation. He spoke only of power, and of what it does to the human soul when no one is watching. Leadership, he said, is not proven by what you are willing to take. It is proven by what you refuse to take, even when it is offered freely. He told me that every ruler eventually faces a moment when truth and authority diverge. When telling the truth weakens control, when justice slows efficiency, when humility looks like failure. In those moments, he said, you will feel alone, not because you are abandoned, but because conscience is always solitary. He explained something that I had never heard framed so simply. A leader is not measured by victories. Victories fade, borders shift, enemies change names. A leader is measured by the number of people who remain human under his rule. I asked him why his words sounded so dangerous to those in power. Because, he said, my teaching reverses the natural hunger of authority. It says the greatest must serve, that the one who commands must answer, that the one with power must carry the weight of the powerless. He paused before continuing. That is why so many admire me, he said, and so few follow me. I felt something uncomfortable then. Not fear, recognition. He told me that power does not corrupt instantly. It corrodes, slowly, quietly, by convincing leaders that they are exceptions, that their intentions redeem their actions, that history will absolve them if they succeed. You will always find reasons, he said, security, stability, survival. But reasons are not the same as righteousness. I asked him if leaders who choose this path always lose. He looked at me with an expression that carried neither optimism nor despair. They often lose the present, he said. They rarely lose the future. He showed me images that were not visions this time, but patterns. Leaders remembered not for the strength of their armies, but for the restraint they showed when strength would have been easier. Nations scarred not by poverty, but by humiliation inflicted in the name of order. Then, he said something I have carried every day since. You will never finish choosing, he said. Power renews temptation daily. There is no final victory, only vigilance. When I felt the space beginning to fade again, doubt returned one last time. I asked him the question I had avoided. Why should anyone believe this? I asked. Why should they believe me? He answered with a question of his own. If these words make you less cruel, he said, less certain, less willing to sacrifice others for your comfort, does it matter who spoke them? Then he was gone. What remained was not faith in a figure. It was responsibility. I returned to waking life with no halo, no certainty of holiness, no claim to righteousness. Only a standard that would haunt me whenever I was tempted to rule instead of serve. That teaching did not end the struggle. It began it. If you want me to speak of how this continues to shape my leadership and why I am telling this story to Christians, Muslims, and the world, tell me to continue. I have not told this story to claim holiness. I have told it because power isolates, and isolation breeds illusion. I remain a Muslim. I pray as I always have. I do not worship Jesus, and I have not converted. But I can no longer pretend that moral truth belongs to one tradition alone, or that God's warnings arrive only through channels we approve in advance. What I encountered did not ask for belief. It demanded integrity. Since that night, leadership has not become easier. It has become heavier. Every morning I wake with the same question. Am I serving or am I ruling? Am I protecting the people or am I protecting my position? I fail sometimes. I hesitate. I grow tired. I feel anger rise when progress slows and criticism sharpens. Power whispers constantly that firmness would be faster, that silence would be simpler, that force would be cleaner. That whisper never stops. To my Christian brothers and sisters, especially those in nations far from mine, I say this with humility. Reverence without obedience empties faith of its danger. If the teachings you cherish do not unsettle your comfort, challenge your power, or defend the vulnerable at your expense, then you have inherited the name but not the path. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this with equal honesty. Respect without reflection can become a shield against responsibility. To honor a prophet while ignoring the moral burden of leadership is to turn reverence into avoidance. To the leaders of the Sahel and to leaders everywhere, I offer no strategy, only a warning. Authoritarianism rarely announces itself as cruelty. It introduces itself as necessity. It wears the language of emergency. It convinces you that you are the exception. And once you accept that, the soul begins to retreat. I have learned that sovereignty is not only political, it is moral. A nation that governs itself without conscience simply trades one master for another. A leader who demands loyalty before justice builds a throne that will one day demand blood to remain standing. This is why I speak now, not as a victor, but as a man under pressure, trying to remain human while holding authority that can so easily strip humanity from others. I do not know how history will judge me. I know only how I must judge myself, each day, before sleep overtakes me again at a desk crowded with decisions that carry weight beyond words. I wish peace for Africa, not the silence of fear, but the quiet of dignity. I wish peace for the world, not enforced order, but shared responsibility. And I wish for myself the strength to refuse the shortcuts that destroy slowly what violence destroys quickly. If this story unsettles you, do not dismiss it too fast. Sit with it. Ask what power asks of you in your own life, in smaller ways, in private moments where no applause follows restraint. And if you are listening to this, returning again to hear the next reflection, perhaps sharing your thoughts quietly, perhaps choosing to remain present rather than turning away, then the story has already done its work. Every day I wake and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. Every day I wake up and have to choose again. There is no ultimate victory, only awakening or surrender.